Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield, welcoming you to episode 133 of the podcast that explores our place in time. Who better to join us on this exploration than Dr. Brian Swimme, professor of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies, someone who was very, very nearly my own graduate advisor, someone whose work has definitely informed and inspired me, as well as many other people, including many the former guests of this show who have been involved in that program. Brian is a real interesting case. He has a PhD in mathematics for work on gravitational dynamics, but has spent most of his career trying to help us rewrite the story of our cosmos, to tell a story about a living universe in which we play active participatory roles, a universe that is coming awake through us. I mean, I have to admit, I wish more mathematical physicists took this stance, but, they probably will in the years to come. In this episode, we take a granular look at his book, The Universe is a Green Dragon, which is not new. It's been around for a while, but I find it such a fun and accessible entry point to the distinctions between our sort of current reigning paradigm and what seems obviously due to replace it, that it seemed worth poring over in more detail. Before we get started, I want to point you to some of the cool stuff that Brian is doing right now. He has a class on Coursera, Journey of the Universe, a story for our times, offered by Yale. And he also has this lovely and award-winning documentary, Journey of the Universe. I will link to both of those things in the show notes, so be sure to trip on over there for more if you enjoy his warmth and his insight in this conversation. Also, I want to take a moment to thank all 155 Future Fossils Patreon supporters, including the total windfall of new supporters that have picked up in the last couple weeks, including William Bass, Oliver Ness, Jacob Bruns, James Fairbairn, Topher Sipes, my old homie who I hope to get on the show here soon, Simon Hajduk, another fantastic visionary artist that deserves some time on the mic, and Sophia Minson. Thanks to each and every one of you from the bottom of my heart for helping keep this show independent and ad-free and allowing me to continue to pursue the most interesting conversations that I can imagine without any obligation to the commercial concerns of advertising partners. Anyone who's been listening to Future Fossils recently knows that I also just picked up the duties of hosting and producing a different podcast for the Santa Fe Institute, where I work during the days, Complexity Podcast, and I see these two as very complementary overall. Complexity is much more focused on rigorous scientific research, sort of the sober daytime version of Future Fossils, if you will. But the amount of work required to do them both is just stunning, and it keeps me constantly absorbed. And, your support of Future Fossils really encourages me to continue putting in the extensive work that it takes to keep the light on here. Also, it allows me to create all sorts of other cool stuff for people that I've been releasing behind the Patreon backstage curtain, including recent book club conversations about the Three-Body Problem series by Lucy Jean, which have just been absolutely wonderful, and those recordings are up, as well as new studio recordings. Those of you who do not know, I've been a singer-songwriter for 20 years, and this is like the only opportunity that I have anymore to continue to create new and interesting compositions and actually produce and publish them. I also just put out a secret Future Fossils episode with Zach Nasser and Matt Dorsey a little while back on nutrition and nootropics, which I think is probably the most informative and immediately practically helpful episode that we've ever had on this show. And over the holiday break, I will be releasing tons of other cool stuff, secret recordings that I have made with Ramin Nazer, as well as music producer East Forest and quantum theorist Sky Nelson Isaacs. So if you feel that Future Fossils adds something to your life, then please consider chipping in a couple bucks a month and joining the Patreon community. I will deeply, deeply appreciate it, as will my baby daughter. Shameless plug for Awesome Baby. Oh no, I feel dirty. Even if you're absolutely broke, I'm glad that you're listening to this show and that folks have been sharing these conversations with your friends. That's immensely helpful. Leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts. I'm sure you know just how wonderful it is every time I find out that someone found this show through a review or a recommendation. So yes, thank you deeply, all of you. And I've got some other great interviews lined up for the beginning of next year that I'm really excited about. And I'll tell you more about that in the Future Fossils Facebook group as we move on. In fact, if you are interested in making guest suggestions or topical suggestions for 2020, I am all ears. You can leave me a note in the Facebook group, or you can email futurefossilspodcast@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy this conversation.
I would love to just talk about whatever comes up and whatever you'd like to look at. What I know about is kind of the universe, so that obviously will show up eventually.
Well, okay. Seeing as it is that we're talking about the universe today, Brian Swimme, it's a pleasure to have you on Future Fossils.
Great to be here, Mike.
I've been reading your the book that your friend Devin sent me, The Universe is a Green Dragon. And admittedly, that's almost 20 years old. So I suspect that your thinking on some of these matters may have evolved in that time.
Well, for instance, I can give you one example.
Yeah.
I talked the universe being 14 billion years old, and now I would have to say it's 14 billion and 20 years old. So there are some updating.
Fair enough. Yeah, well, I don't know really how much the scientific advancements that have occurred in the last 18 or 20 years or whatever affect the actual substance of your work, which I understand to be an attempt at helping sort of reboot a useful metaphysics. I mean, this notion of cosmic forces that we embody as, a product of this universal creativity, that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that gets revised when we discover the Higgs boson, for example.
If you don't mind, why don't you ask the question again?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, I guess it's a sort of an A and a B, right? The first is, it seems that your work as a cosmologist, in the words of my friend Zach Stein, an attempt at a modern or perhaps postmodern metaphysics, a way of integrating our scientific understanding with our sense of meaning and purpose, and the interior life of the mind and our sense of place in the cosmos. And in that sense, I guess the B of that question was that it seems as though that kind of work is relatively robust, and that it's not going to be disrupted by like the recent discoveries in particle physics and so on.
Yeah, great question. I let me start off and say that I really love the work you're doing, like with people like Zach Stein. I admire his work. I agree with it completely. I feel like, in a certain sense, there's a a resonance between what I'm doing and what Zach and you and others are doing. But there is a difference. And the difference is that I think of myself as a storyteller. I really just tell stories about the universe. Now, it's true that when you tell a story of the universe, you're going to have a metaphysics. A lot of scientists will say, no, I don't have a metaphysics. I'm just recording the facts. But it's not the case. The way in which we organize the facts, there's an underlying philosophical orientation, a metaphysics. But I'm not. That isn't what I do. I couldn't even tell you what my metaphysics are in any detailed way. But I think of myself as a person who has learned a lot about the universe and just is amazed by it and wants to tell stories about it, really. And so, actually, as the new discoveries in science come along, it alters and changes and develops the stories that I tell, because I always want them rooted in our contemporary understanding. I hope you don't see this as trying to distance myself from metaphysics. It's more trying to be honest about what I do, really, Michael.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I think, something that we discuss on this show a lot is, in locating ourselves in time, I think that notion is, requires a narrative frame to some extent, or, I sometimes I play with the idea that it's that there may be ways for us to move into sort of nonlinear and networked understandings that are not, so singular as the story. But, the fact is that we still, like, you talk about in this fabulous book, that it would be a mistake to divorce ourselves from the story in an attempt to move into whatever new thing is taking shape. And in particular, I'm really curious to hear you expound on this thing that you talk about very early in the book, actually. The realization that, I'm quoting from page 40, the realization that rather than having a universe filled with things, we are enveloped by a universe that is a single energetic event, a whole, a unified, multiform, and glorious outpouring of being. That seems to me to be the distillation, or sort of the objective of your story.
You identified the absolute heart of the book, Michael. Don't read another page. It's all downhill from there. That's it. God, you went right to it. Fantastic. And I think that's one of the great things we're learning, is that we're part of a whole. We've been socialized into thinking of ourselves as individuals and separate and so forth. There's some truth there, but what is amazing is that there's this energy event taking place. We're part of it. Everything's part of it, and that, I don't know. I found that just so exciting. And I love your phrase, by the way, locating ourselves in time. That could be the title of our entire conversation. I think locating ourselves in time is the fundamental spiritual and scientific challenge.
So how do you see us struggling or succeeding to rise to that challenge right now in 2019 as a species?
Okay. The way in which I think we are moving into a new way of locating ourselves in time is to realize that, like I just said, we're enveloped in a whole drama. I mean, this has been going on. Humans have been here for 200,000 years, but this drama of the universe has been going on for 14 billion years. So we wake up inside of a story, and the unfortunate part about the modern period, which you and your colleagues are pointing out, is that we tend to think of everything in human terms. And so we talk about Western civilization or industrial society or the human species, but that's just a little tiny part of what's taking place. As we begin to understand ourselves as a mode of this whole vast unfolding energy, it changes how we think of ourselves and how we orient ourselves in the midst of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, something about the way that the rhetorical device that you employ in this book that I love, that I've found myself drawn to over the years, is for instance, my case, I think of photosynthesis creating this oxygen catastrophe in our atmosphere as a sort of foreshadowing of the Industrial Revolution and our pollution of the atmosphere. And there's something about the casting of what we think of as the prehistoric world in the terms of the human and the contemporary that seems extremely important. So I love in your book how you describe, for example, the Earth as a corporation. And I would love to hear you lay that out a little bit, because there's something, we've touched on this so many times on this show about what it means to full cost accounting, what it means, the problem of inadequate measurement of value and all of that. And I'd love to hear you go into that.
Yeah, it's the idea that the kind of the underlying, the underlying metaphysics here. I'm using a word I said I wasn't going to, but the underlying metaphysics of the modern period can be summarized in various ways. But this is how Thomas Berry, who was my teacher, this is how he summarized it. He said, we think we live in a universe that is a collection of objects. And he's trying to replace that with another view, which I won't tell you right now because I'm trying to focus on your question. And we think of the universe as a collection of objects, and I thought, God, that is so true. I mean, we think of the Earth as a collection of objects. So, for instance, in simplistic terms, we think of Earth as like a hardware store. It has all this stuff, and then we can go in there and take it, and we can rearrange it any way we want and make stuff. It's like we think of Earth as like a gravel pit, and instead of that, we have to recognize that the Earth has been organizing itself for 4 billion years. It has brought forth life. I'm very much convinced that the Earth is closer to a living organism than it is to a collection of objects. Now, people can argue about, well, Earth isn't really an organism. Yeah, it's not. But it's closer to being something like a tree or a forest than it is a gravel pit. So the notion is the Earth has been spectacularly successful in bringing forth life and vitality, mind, beauty. And so our challenge is how to actually fit in to this enveloping community. And one way is to recognize that all of the great words we use to describe humans are true of the Earth as well, and in a certain sense, even more so. So, for instance, we are so impressed with the intelligence of humans. Our brains are big, and we can think and all the rest of it. But then we have to take in the fact that Earth brought us forth. So it's true the Earth as a whole doesn't have a brain. Nevertheless, it has the creative intelligence required to bring forth brains. So, I'm trying to make that reversal. Now, another example is we talk about human economics, and then everything on the planet has to fit into human economics. Well, as a matter of fact, Earth has had an economic system, for a very, very long time, keeping track of energy exchanges. The fish have an economics, the forest has an economics, and we come along billions of years later, and we have an economics. So we have to understand that we have to fit into the enveloping economic system rather than trying to stuff it into ours. That figure ground reversal is what I think is the most difficult one for the modern industrial human to make. Yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's an interesting, again, there's something interesting going on in this work in terms of your casting of all of human activity as a particular or specific instance of the interplay of these cosmic forces, even as you use language that would suggest the opposite, that like, Earth is a corporation, as this whole book, for listeners, by the way, this whole book is in the form of a conversation between a sort of wise elder and a curious youth. And so it makes sense in that regard to start with the familiar. But, I think that it seems to me as though your goal ultimately is to perhaps get people to move past that and to encourage the supposition that actually a corporation is in some sense like a specific kind of ecosystem, or that, that these ideas, however we choose to manipulate them, are insufficient. And actually your book starts out that way, just being like, good luck. So.
Good luck. I like that. Let me try to make it specific and give you a sense of locating ourselves in time, because I think, like, I just love that phrase of yours. And one of the great discoveries in science, and we're free to interpret it because it's just an amazing discovery, and it's that the universe sets about to create different eras of its unfolding, and it does this in a way that is irreversible. So, for instance, an example would be 12 billion years ago, the universe set about creating galaxies. Now, before that moment, it was not possible for a galaxy to be created. And after that time, there has not been a single galaxy created. But 12 billion years ago, the universe set about creating these galaxies, and it created something like 2 trillion galaxies all at once. And then that was done with, in a certain sense, that structure was put in place. Now, even earlier, the same thing happened with the element of hydrogen. All of the hydrogen was brought forth at 380,000 years after the birth of the universe. It couldn't come forth before, and now we're given all this hydrogen from that great cosmic event. So also here, just let me give you one last one, a third one.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the third one is life on planet Earth. Well, Earth complexified to a point when suddenly life came roaring forth. And the scientists refer to this as the self-organizing dynamics of the universe, and in this case, of the Earth. So Earth complexified, and then suddenly life came forth. Life has not been invented again since then. It was there. That was the time of giving birth to life. And many biologists speculate that if life ever ended on planet Earth, it would not come forth because that capacity has been used. So in this way of thinking now, I'm taking the word intelligence, and I'm saying that word refers not just to humans, but also to the entire cosmic process. I don't mean that the universe is thinking like a human. I'm simply saying that the universe is manifesting an intelligence that is beyond our understanding at this time. But we can begin to feel its presence when we look at the vast sweep of time. So then the question is, for humans, what time is it? What time is it? And the answer is this. It's time for us to participate in giving birth to another era of Earth that couldn't come forth earlier and won't come forth if we don't bring it forth now. That it is, and it's not that this is something that we are doing on our own. A galaxy doesn't create itself on its own. It's part of a whole vast universe. So we humans that are alert, we're participating in this deep form of, it can be called cosmic intelligence, so long as a person realizes I'm not talking about something that's strange. I'm talking about the processes the universe uses that we study in science and that we write about in poetry. So that's the question I would love to awaken in humans today. What are the ways in which we are drawn to participate in a very, very deep form of creativity?
Yeah, it's something that I find myself routinely butting up against in conversation with other folks who would self-describe as futurists, is that, and you talk about this in a couple parts of the book, including the chapter on land and memory, this issue of going back an insufficient, I don't know how to say this, distance in time. Just forgive the spatialization metaphor.
Yeah.
But that, that if our memory is shallow, that we're bound to sort of just recreate these cyclic things, and rather than anchoring ourselves as deeply as possible and using that as the roots or the springboard from which to create something truly new. And so I'm curious, as someone who's given so much thought to these matters, where you see people mistaking the past for the future, or thinking that we're creating something radically new when in fact we're just sort of repeating ourselves.
Could you ask it again? It's a great question. I'm thinking as you talk.
Yeah. So, I think a lot about, for example, in the conversation around the technological singularity, that there's this notion that we are creating the noosphere through our, our machines, or that we're going to, somehow birth a God mind. And it seems to me to be such a flagrant and offensive, willful ignorance of, first of all, the sort of ever-present origin that you talk about, that Jean Gebser talks about, this notion that creativity, that we live already within the singularity, and that creation is constant, and that it is already beyond our understanding, and that that there's I think a strong theological argument that if we were contained in the body of some vaster intelligence than our own individual minds, that we wouldn't even necessarily recognize it, that it would be, sort of a over the rainbow, sort, like over the horizon of our own ability to compute. And so, I think it's almost, in that sense, it's sort of forgivable that we think that we're making this thing, but that, a lot of people have talked about this, about, the notion that to project what already is, that language, the origins of language itself was a singularity, and that to project this thing that we're living within already, that each of us must develop through in our lives, that it's a mistake. It's a profound mistake to see it as ahead of us somehow, and like undeveloped.
Yes, I see. I'm getting a better understanding of what you're saying, and let's think about that together. There's a way in which one of the fundamental errors of the modern period is ruining this idea of the singularity, and because it's thinking of ourselves as the intelligent species in a world that is basically a collection of objects, and then as you were saying, we imagine that we, with our clever minds, we're creating technology, and that will give birth to the singularity. And I think that is a perfect example of what I'm trying to suggest is the mistake. Rather than joining a process, I love that you brought up this notion of the noosphere, which comes really from the French paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and his sense that life, created the geosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and that now what is coming forth is this noosphere, by which he meant an envelope of thought was going to surround the Earth and be something like a global brain or a planetary mind. He left that a little bit open. And I think it's a stunning insight, because it emphasizes the amazing ability of humans to synergize their minds with one another. In a real sense, this is the distinguishing characteristic of humans. And let me say it another way, is that we have found a way to store our learning and our information, our knowledge, outside of our brains, so that we build up culturally an ongoing accumulation of knowledge and insight. That is something that no species has done. Now, I have no doubt that language exists in almost all animal species. They have a language, they can communicate. But what they don't have is a way of storing their learning, individual learning, and to be able to pass that on. With other animals, unless the DNA is changed and captures what adaptations come along, then the future generations can't benefit from what an individual learned. We're different. We can benefit from one person comes up with a great idea that can be stored and shared throughout the whole. So humans don't really enter into the story with just their own individual mind. They have a mind that's 200,000 years in the making. And that's what Teilhard was excited about, this idea that because we were bringing our thought together, we're creating an entire envelope of intelligence for the planet Earth. Now, that's, I think, a brilliant idea. It's somewhat distorted in the ways that you have listed. It's distorted when we start to think that we are in charge of this as activity with our machines, with our computers, with our hookups. So I think that is also part of the change. When we see that we are participating in the emergence of another level of mind, I think we will see the noosphere as a force for evoking life, rather than right now, the world of artificial intelligence is only exacerbating the assault on the planet.
I'd love to sort of wangle this conversation towards your cosmic forces, the way that you have sort of updated a 5 elements view of things, because there's something in here at the very end of your chapter on the sea that I think is relevant to this issue of, are we discovering or creating, the sort of James P. Carse finite and infinite games thing about culture as a process of constant renewal, which to me suggests a way of reconciling the seemingly opposed facts that there is nothing new under the sun and that we are vital and irreplaceably contributing something novel and surprising and fresh.
Yeah.
And you say here, your Thomas Berry wise elder figure is constantly reminding the curious youth in this book is that, he only found out about cosmic background radiation and the ever-present origin of our cosmos like a few hours ago.
Yeah.
So how can you be so presumptuous? And so to assume that something or that something is or is not a certain way. And you say, we are awash with the presence of the universe, already swamped in its beauty. All things have discharged themselves into the world, merely awaiting our development of the sensitivity to respond to them. And so, that's the chapter on water and the cosmic force of sensitivity and, what I think of as like an evolutionary guy as like recombinance, recombinant novelty and the constantly permutating identity of things. It reminds me of like years and years ago, I was listening to the Bjork song Modern Things, where she talks about how all of the modern things have always been there in a mountain, just basically waiting for us to become aware of them. And that this notion that, in a sense, that the noosphere has always been there, but in some sort of like dormant form, like a seed form.
Yes.
So I feel like this is where we can get into back to that issue of a linear narrative being insufficient, but a narrative in which we have, constant reinterpretation and discovery and what they call in fan fiction, like retconning, where like the sequel to a story will completely reimagine the original story.
What does retconning mean?
So like retconning, the worst example of retconning is in the Star Wars prequels when they say that the Force is the product of midichlorians, these, like the microorganisms living in Force-talented individuals, that it's a way of altering all of the previous films, of shifting our perspective on them. To call the Earth a corporation is, I think, a much more pleasant and useful form of retconning. I think it means retroactively converting, but I'm not quite clear on that. Anyway, there's something about the backward glance at all of this that I find interesting in terms of locating ourselves in time, and like the importance of reinterpreting our world. And I'd love to hear you go on that.
Yeah, and I like the way you said, maybe my way into these questions that you're asking, which are all essential, would be to pick up on this. You used the phrase, you said the noosphere has always been here, but it's been in a latent form. I really like that. Let me just connect to that one phrase, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that really blew my mind was when I realized that in the early universe, I'm talking about the universe when it was 1 minute old, all right? 1 minute. Even then, the presence of long burning stars could be talked about. Now, and when the universe was 1 minute old, it consisted of elementary particles. It was in a state of plasma. There was nothing even as complex as a single atom in existence. Nothing had been constructed beyond the elementary particles. And yet, there's a way in which long burning stars were there. In other words, they were there in latent form, and they were waiting to come forth. Now, I'm using language there poetically, but
it's okay.
Yeah, but I like, for instance, what we've learned is that in order to have a long burning star, you have to have a strong nuclear interaction that holds protons together. So protons are both positive charged electrically, so they're forcing themselves apart. But you need a force that will hold them together. But what we've discovered is that force holding them together has to be of a certain intensity. If it's too strong, you're not going to have long burning stars. If it's too weak, you're not going to. So this is the discovery of what some people refer to as the fine tuning of the universe, which I really don't like. It's because who's tuning it? But if we think of this as there's a way in which there's a fundamental elegance from the very beginning of the universe that enables a creative unfolding that is continually astonishing. And that is at least my way of thinking about what you just said, that the noosphere was actually present from the very beginning, but in latent form. So I want to develop that just one more step, and it's related to what I just said, the way long burning stars were present. I believe that we can see how the human consciousness was present at that early time. And this idea goes back to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. But what he says is that the gravitational interaction from the beginning of time was going to result in stars and planets that were spherical. And he makes this amazing observation. He said, on a spherical planet, a species like the human is going to fold back on itself. It's going to fan out in all directions around the planet, and then it's going to meet itself again. So it's going to have to deal with itself on a deeper level. And it's through that interaction that we have the development and complexification of human consciousness, and eventually this explicit form of the noosphere. So the noosphere exists in latent form, even in the gravitational interaction at the beginning of time. And that's a long explanation, but I'm excited by the way in which you asked the question. I apologize.
Oh, no need. Yeah, that's... So, one of the things I think I've already said this on this call, but one of the things I like about this book is that it's not so much that you humanize what modernity thinks of as like impersonal cosmic forces, as it is that you cosmicize what we think of as, uniquely human. And
I love it.
You do this in, the first step in this is drawing a line from gravity to human fascination, to human interest in things, which I love because, I've been thinking a lot about this ever since I saw it. There's this fantastic documentary called Proteus about the life and work of Ernst Haeckel. He coined the term ecology.
Yes.
This documentary makes the case about his work, that his work wasn't even possible. His beautiful illustrations of all of these thousands of newly discovered marine species was only made possible by the repeated failed attempt to stretch a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean to connect the New York and the London Stock Exchange. And that every time that they dropped this cable into the sea, and sometimes it snapped and they'd have to pull it back up, and they would find all of these deep sea creatures that, at the time it was believed that the bottom of the ocean could only be a frozen, barren desert expanse, that there was nothing alive down there. And so this documentary makes a really suggestive constellation about, our historical appreciation of or connection between the ocean and the unconscious mind, and like the emergence of depth psychology and ecology as sort of twins at the end of the 19th century, and how all of it is anchored, as you say, in the allurement, that this webbing together of things that's become a sort of the network religion of Silicon Valley is just like one instance of this, but that this sort of Teilhard de Chardin drive to connect everything to everything is, in a way, that you can look at these economic forces drawing us together into these patterns of interdependency as a point on a continuum between cosmic allurement in the form of gravity and human allurement in the form of love. And so in that sense, that there's something innately gross, if you're willing to go here with me, that there's something that this process of novelty and the constant remixing and emergent forms is challenging to our sense of who we are and where our boundaries are, and that even as we're constantly pulled beyond ourselves by our fascination, our attention to things, our longing for intimacy with one another or with, some cherished activity, that the sort of price of that is transformation. And that means that the future is inherently offensive to whatever sort of static identity we have created for ourselves, that it's kind of like disgusting, to think about how much more fluid and more connected and more metamorphic we seem to inevitably become. I don't know if this is like, I have compassion for people who fear the kind of cosmic participation that you're talking about, because it requires a transfigurement of the person that they believe themselves to be. And that's true. That's true whether we're talking about a story in which human activity is something that the planet is doing. That was true in the 19th century when people were offended by the retconning of the human story, such that we were the descendants of, primates. And that's true in every conversation I have with everyone about this, refigurement of the boundary between the human and the machine. This notion that we, again, it gets back to this issue of dispensing with this idea that we are separate objects bumping into each other. And yet it's also valid, it's also valid that like there's a good reasons not to want a brain implant, for example. So I don't know, like how do you make sense of this notion that this sort of cosmopolitan identity is so likely to induce something like future shock in people? In a way, what you're prescribing for folks is a kind of, psychedelic ego death. And like, how do you interpret, how do you respond to what I think is a very natural human impulse to be repelled by the idea of stuff like the microbiome or cyborgs, or, the idea that we're merely, to some, merely the activity of the planet or the cosmos. Like, what do you do with that? And like, do you feel those? Do you have those feelings?
I have a sense that the universe is striving to give expression to itself, and one of the features of the universe is what Thomas Berry calls differentiation. So that as we move through this journey, things are becoming more differentiated. The number of species on the planet increases over time. As you go in and you look at the development of any intellectual discipline, it differentiates over time. And so this power of differentiation has reached a new level of intensity with humans. It's almost the case that individual humans can end up differing from each other the way entire species differ from each other. So I actually think that you spoke about the latency. So the way in which the noosphere was latent, even in the early universe, I think exactly the same is true of every human. Just to focus on humans for a second, that not only are there essences latent, but the universe actually depends upon these potentialities coming forth and being developed. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the primary tasks for each of us, each human being, is to give birth to an expression of life that has never existed before. There is a way in which I think that things are coming into manifest form that have been latent from the beginning, but that have not been fully expressed until now. So I see this as a thrilling role for an individual, and I don't feel the sense that we are losing our individuality. We can, but I don't think the universe actually wants us to. I think it wants a full expression of our unique form of beauty that each of us potentially is. That's how I would view it.
Yeah, so, in The Universe is a Green Dragon, you bring this up with, respect to the problem of evil. And your theodicy involves, again, referring to allurement as sort of this cosmic force of which gravity is one example, love is another, fascination, that again, like these things, as they bring us together, they transform us in service of, through this sensitivity that each of us also possess, and into, a surprising and emergent new thing. And so I'd like to hear you expound on that a little bit and how you understand, again, Chardin, one of my favorite quotes of his is, hyper-collectivization leads to hyper-personalization.
Yeah, beautiful.
And yet, what that means in the sort of everyday street level sense is that we are constantly challenged by the alien, by the other, as we unfold and embrace more and more. Yeah. And so you end up, we're at a point now where I think, in a sort of brick and mortar terms, it's easy to see in a sort of cosmic way how the diversity of human opinions is a beautiful phenomenon, but it leads to all of these, tragic misunderstandings and ideological conflicts. And one of those conflicts right now that's very palpable is between the people who are willing to embrace an expansion of identity, like the kind that you're describing, and those that are digging into their positions, to fundamentalist tribal identities and so on. So really my question is, like, how do you hold space for, how do you communicate with the folks that are not willing to get on the magic bus with you here?
The magic bus. Like that. Well, I would, I tell stories from the universe and as a way of encouraging people to think about things in a new way. And it would be that this universe we live in gives birth to itself through relationship. So that the example I love the most is the elementary particles, the neutron and the proton. So we tend to think of them as there they are. Okay, you got a proton, you got a proton. That's what it is. You got a neutron, you got a neutron. No, if you have a neutron by itself and you just watch it, within 3 or 4 minutes, it will disintegrate. It's called radioactivity. It will fall apart into the elementary particles. Now, on the other hand, if you bring a neutron into relationship with a proton, it will exist for 1 billion years. So that my way of interpreting that is to say that the very nature of the neutron relies upon forming a relationship with a proton in order for it to express itself. Now, the same thing, that's at the elementary particle level, but the same thing is true with life. If you look at an animal like a hawk, all right, and then you look at its prey, like a field mouse. The field mouse may not like the hawk, but nevertheless, each of them is giving rise to the other, because if the mouse develops speed to get away from the hawk. So through time, it becomes more and more what we regard as the mouse. And the hawk, just to deal with the mouse's speed, has to develop better eyesight, better speed on its own, so that it's in the relationship. It doesn't even have to be a happy relationship. But in the relationship is the activation of the deep, essential nature of each of us. So we live in a time when we live on this round planet, and so the different human groups are necessarily having to interact with one another as we enter into deeper relationship, both antagonistic relationships and benevolent relationships. Our true nature comes forth. That would be the view of the evolutionary cosmos, I believe.
So I want to take a right angle, sort of, in this conversation.
Great.
Yeah, maybe 80 degrees is
okay.
Again, to this notion of sensitivity, because I actually almost, I think I in our emails leading up to this, I think I told you I was almost one of your students at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and it was at a time when I was...
Then you're sobered up and made a good decision.
Well, as far as being able to afford to live in San Francisco, that was ultimately my decision. But, what I ended up studying with Sean Hargens at JFKU was, and what has been my abiding interest, the fascination I pursue, is the role of the interior, the role of perception and the interpretation of meaning in the evolutionary process. And you say something really lovely here about sensitivity being a property of matter. I'm curious to explore that with you. That there is something about the fact that, the difference between, for example, being able to make use of, like your youth character in this book,
Yeah.
is incapable of making any kind of use of the knowledge of the cosmic background radiation until he has it. That, the difference between something breaking sort of through into greater organization and sapience and adventurous play, as you put it, and breaking down into, like, why is the fire of metabolism structured, but then we burn a log and it just falls apart? And it seems to have to do with the capacity for the sensitivity of the entity in question, that whether we can make use of that which is available to us, like a radiation-eating fungus versus, I walk into the same nuclear waste and I die,
Yeah.
And what do you think of all that?
Michael, I think your question is central in that it isn't until just recently that scientists have begun to ask questions about consciousness, about perception. Now, other cultures, of course, have concerned themselves with these questions, but in the West, it's only now, really, that we're taking seriously this question of sensitivity and perception. And it could be that the future of science is going to depend upon the way in which it draws in the question of the within, of the inner world, along with its exploration of the outer world. So I guess what I would begin by saying is that I think, just to talk about my own work, I think my own work in telling the story of the universe is to awaken another dimension of human consciousness, in the sense that we're aware of the cosmic microwave background radiation. You've referred to this several times. And this we've discovered, in other words, the light from the beginning of time. And now that can be considered knowledge of the universe out there, and it is. But at the same time, this light is what has given birth to us. These elementary particles from the beginning of time have complexified into us. So then our consciousness is aware that what it is looking at is what is looking. Our consciousness of the microwave radiation is now at a point where it realizes it is beholding that which is beholding. And this folding back of the universe on itself in our perception, in our consciousness, I think is deeply rooted in the transformation we find ourselves within. It's just another way of being in the universe. And I'm just amazed by it. Another way of saying it, because it's so hard to integrate it into our lives, because we've all been socialized in the modern world. But here's an image that let's see if you like this image as a way to hold on to this. Just imagine the scientist who is a typical, objective scientific type, like almost all of us in the Western culture, and he's examining a brain of a particular fish. He's really getting into the brain. It's fantastic. And then as he's doing this, he realizes, God, I love my life as a scientist. Who am I thankful for? And he thinks about his parents. They put him through grad school, all that kind of stuff. But then he thinks further, and he realizes, wow, I have to be grateful to not only my parents, but to the fish that created the brains that developed into my brain. And so then he's realizing in that moment that he is the further development of the fish reflecting on the fish. And it's a movement out of kind of an us-them and inside-outside and a dualistic point of view into simply a feeling of astonishment that our consciousness is in the midst of this change that is going to affect an entire planet. So that is how I think how important the development of the within, of spirituality, of consciousness. So there's different ways of saying it, but I think your inquiry is, I think it's central to our time, and it's not surprising that someone who is on the cutting edge like you would be experiencing this allurement into this investigation. You're being drawn in by cosmic creativity.
Well, there is, I mean, only to the extent that we can talk about an inside and an outside, right?
Yeah.
Brian, this is wonderful. Out of respect for your time and our scheduled calendar settings, it seems right to draw a bow on this, although I feel like we've only sort of nicked the surface. But
I like fun talking with you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for inviting me in.
Absolutely. So I like to end these with a question, which is, we've talked about the notion that the future is sort of curled up within the present in some way, present already. And in a way, this show is based on a conversation that I had with my friend years ago about what it has done for her to live as though her life is observed by the unborn generations. Or as my friend Dr. Blue would say, that we are a past life experience of our future selves. So I guess what the question is around, what does it change, or like, how do you feel it substantially alters one's relationship to life, or your relationship to life, to regard the future as present in this now, or to stretch the now wide enough to include that future in our daily considerations? Like, what does that do for you? And then what, if any, message might you attempt to pass forward, as I, clumsily put it, into that future, into the minds of those unborn historians that, I foolishly hope are listening to this program?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. How does it, so you're saying, taking that perspective, how does it affect me?
Yeah, does it change anything? I mean, because you're pretty dialed into a cosmic perspective, but it is a perspective that feels very much about there being a cutting edge, about that cutting edge being now, a frothy bow wave of cosmic unfolding. And what if it's not? What if we're, actually in dialogue of some kind with the unborn, and it's like the cosmic radiation we have yet to discover? And like, what changes when we do? Yeah,
it's such a great question, because it breaks out of the superficiality of a lot of our culture to think about the distant future. I can only tell you how I think about it, and this isn't something I normally speak about, but it's my way of remembering where we are. I think of my life and my activities as something like foreplay for the distant future. And I don't just mean sexual foreplay. I mean, it's an attempt to bring forth a joy and happiness. And if I had a message to send to them, it would be something like, well, we did the best we can to activate your joy, and carry on.
I love it. Brian, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Michael, and keep at it. This is great work you're doing.
Certainly. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Future Fossils. This podcast is a part of the MindPod network, along with numerous other excellent programs. Go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. If you'd like to help support Future Fossils, consider giving this show a 5-star iTunes review, or sharing it with someone you think might appreciate these conversations. For more episodes, show notes, copious extras including music, art, the Future Fossils coloring book and book club, and more, visit patreon.com/Michael Garfield.